Hi, I'm Kimberly Haar, and you're listening to the Caretakers Journey Podcast.
Welcome, my friends, to another meaningful conversation. I'm your host, Carol Leatham, and my guest today, Kimberly Haar. As a domestic violence survivor, Kimberly brings a message of hope and encouragement to women navigating life's darkest seasons. I am so excited for you to meet her because her story is not about a villain and a victim. And when I read that in her book, I thought, wow, this is so good because it's about how God has the ability to take our broken dreams, our broken hearts, and our broken lives and make something beautiful of them, no matter your story. So today I find myself, while our experiences aren't the same, I find myself really encouraged and inspired by her story. And when I picked up her book, which is called Healing from Life's Deepest Hurts, I knew her message of thriving in trauma and moving forward with courage and resilience when life doesn't turn out the way we planned was one that our community needed to hear. So, while again, each of our communities, our journeys are as caretakers might look different, we all have the same need. Community, community, community. And if you think that you're alone on your journey, grab a cup of your favorite coffee or tea and get ready to be encouraged and inspired. Kimberly, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Carol. I've really been looking forward to this interview.
Oh, wow. When I sat down to read your book from the very first pages, I was held captive. I mean, I opened up the cover, read the first words, and I knew a little bit about your story from a conversation that we had on Zoom. But I sat down to read and I had a hard time closing the cover and going to do some things I needed to do. I just kept wanting to keep reading to find out what was going to happen next. So let's start off with the trauma because we kind of already pulled back the veil and the curtain on that. And the first thing I want to say before we dive into this is if you as a woman are finding yourself in an unsafe place right now, please, please, please get help. There are so many different ways. You could reach out to Kimberly. You could reach out to me. You could reach out, but please, please, please reach out and get help. So let's start with your trauma. Go ahead, dive in and tell us the story of how this all happened.
Yes. Well, I like to start out with in 2013, I made the hardest decision I have ever made in my life. And that was I made the decision to file for divorce from my first husband. I had been married 23 years, and my husband and I had 4 children. And through the 23 years, my ex husband struggled with infidelity, things like pornography, chat rooms. And I had always forgiven and forgiven and forgiven because we had 4 children, and I didn't want our children going from home to home. And so in 2013, I discovered that my ex husband was actually in an affair.
Mm.
And when I discovered that, I knew that I could no longer stay in our marriage. And so I got lots of good, wise counsel, did a lot of prayer, and I just knew the right decision for me at that time was to file for divorce. Now, at the time, our youngest children were still in high school. And so I made the decision that I was just going to be mom for the next 4 years, getting them launched into college, launched as young adults, because I didn't want them to fight for my attention. And honestly, I needed time to heal myself. So I had a friendly divorce. My ex husband and I had even told him, in the next 4 years, get your life together. Figure out what you're doing. And after 4 years, when I'm ready to start, moving forward in my life, we can revisit the idea if we're at a place we may someday want to reconcile, but I just didn't see it. So in 2017, the 4 years had come and gone. And I woke up in January and I felt a stirring inside me that said, this is the year you're going to be married again. And then I even heard the words inside me, buckle your seatbelt, which was kind of funny because I thought, well, that must mean it's going to go fast. Yay. And so where does somebody that's 50 years old go to find a potential partner? I mean, I had only dated one man in 27 years.
Wow.
And so I decided to be brave and I joined 5 dating sites. And
Five,
and
five.
I laugh about it because I was raised in Canada at a fishing camp. My parents owned a fishing lodge. And so I learned about fishing. If when you're fishing, if you put one line in the water, you have a chance at catching one fish. But if you have five lines in the water, you have a better chance of catching a fish. So I thought it must be the same with online dating. And so I joined five dating sites. And I tell you, I did 4 months of first dates. And after 13 first dates, I decided this was not the thing for me because it can be an image killer if you're not careful. So I was ready to hang it up, but I decided I would have one last first date. And my last first date was with a man by the name of Andrew. I met him at a restaurant. And when I met him, I just knew this was the man I was going to marry. And that was not like me. I mean, I am not a make decisions quickly, but we saw each other every night for almost a month. And Andrew was an engineer. And so I laugh at about 2 weeks into our dating relationship, he looked at me and he said, I asked Google how long I need to know somebody before I know I'm in love. And it kind of tickled me because that's definitely his engineer brain wanting the facts and all the data. And so we dated for 4 weeks, and he said, "You know, I wanna marry you." And so we both knew this was the direction this was headed. In the meantime, my ex-husband called me, and he said, "Hey, would you come over? I wanna talk to you about our kids." And that was not something that was unusual. We had talked about our children many times before, but this time when I went to his home to talk to him, he started talking about wanting to date me again. And I told him it was too late, that I was seeing somebody, I was getting serious, and we both needed to move forward with our lives separately. And he made a comment. He said, "Well, maybe I'm just going to have to go talk to that man." And I didn't understand it because I hadn't talked to him anything about him. I didn't even know he knew his name. But when I left my ex-husband's home that night, it was a late night because I'd come after work. And so I left and I called Andrew and I said, "Can I come by your house just for a few minutes?" And by the time I got there, it was about 9 o'clock. And so I went in Andrew's house and I explained the conversation I'd had with my ex-husband. And I said, "I'm really sorry. He may show up at your work. He may harass you. He may spread a rumor. I'm so embarrassed. And please don't be scared away." And I asked him, I said, "Andrew, would you fight for me?" And Andrew looked down at me and he said, "Of course I would." And when I asked him why, he said, "Because you're worth it." Little did I know within 24 hours, not only was Andrew going to be fighting for me, but he was going to be fighting for his life. So I drove home, got in bed, and I wasn't scared. I was living alone, but something stirred in me and said, "Get up and lock your bedroom door." Now, that was not my normal habit. I'm sure I had locked my bedroom door sometimes in the past, but I had no reason to lock my bedroom door. So I got up and I locked my bedroom door. And at 2:30 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door crashing down off the hinges. And my ex-husband was intoxicated. He had broken into my home. He had a gun in his hand. And for the next 4 hours, I was assaulted. And when the assaulting was done, he looked at me and he said, "As punishment for ruining my life, I'm going to make you watch me murder the man you've been dating." And so he held me at gunpoint. We went out to the vehicle and we drove. It was probably about 10, 12 miles to Andrew's house. And when we got there, my ex husband turned to the back seat. He got his gun, he got extra bullets, and he looked at me and he said, "Now you can go do whatever you need to go do." And he left the keys in the ignition. And so I watched as he mounted the first 3 stairs up to Andrew's house. The front door had a big oval lead glass window, and I heard 3 gunshots. And so I knew in my heart there was no way Andrew was gonna survive this. So I jumped into the driver's seat, and I made an escape to a nearby supercenter, and I ran in the front doors and I screamed, "Call 911." the cashiers, it seemed like it was minutes, it seemed like nobody was moving, and now looking back, I was a horrific sight. I was unrecognizable, my face was bloodied, and I looked down into my hand, and I had a cell phone in my hand that I can only it must have been my ex-husband's or from that truck. And so I called 911. I told the operator, "Get the police there, but tell them to be careful because it's not gonna end up good." And from that point, I knew I had done everything I could do, and I was escorted to a back warehouse where I waited for a police officer to come and an ambulance. When the police officer came, he told me, he said, "Ma'am, we've got an ambulance for you. Come with me." And as we were walking out, I said, "I need to go into that vehicle and I need to pick up my cell phone because I wanted to call my family so they didn't see this on the news. They knew I was safe." And when I opened the passenger door of the vehicle I had driven there in, my ex-husband was sitting behind the steering wheel and he was holding a gun pointing it at me. And so I knew in that moment that I was going to die. I had several moments when I thought I was going to die, but I dropped to the ground and screamed, and I quickly had a human shield of police officers around me. I was escorted to safety, and my ex husband was apprehended. And from that point, I was taken to an emergency room in the hospital where I was there, probably 4 to 6 hours, where I answered question after question and I had exam after exam. And during that time, I had not met Andrew's children. He had 3 adult children. And his adult son that I had met called my phone number, and my adult daughter answered the phone, and he said, "My dad's been shot 10 times. He's in and out of surgeries. We think he's gonna be okay. We wish your mom well, but we really think our parents need to go their separate ways." And for me, that was almost more devastating than everything I had just gone through. And because Andrew was under an assumed name in the hospital, we had been taken to 2 different hospitals, I couldn't find him because he had a John Doe name, and so I went home with my parents and stayed there a couple nights, but I knew I couldn't stay there indefinitely, and I had an aunt and uncle who were going to Canada for the summer. And they called me and they said, "Kim, we want to gift you our home for the summer so that you can begin to heal. You don't have to go back to the house everything happened in." And when they gave me a tour of their house, I looked in the backyard and there was the most beautiful big pergola I'd ever seen. But there was like 2 big swings there and there was a big cement floor, and something inside me told me that this is the place my healing was going to begin and this is where I was gonna meet Jesus.
Wow. 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 Okay, I have to take a deep breath here because, you know, we talked just briefly about this before about a month ago when we met. And then when I was reading your book, it's one thing to read the book, but it's another thing to listen and watch as you tell the story. And so it kind of takes your breath away a little bit
Mhm.
because it obviously is not, none of this turned out how you planned. So
No.
I want to deviate away from your story just for a second because I know that you're a therapist. I know that you're a
Mhm.
marriage and family counselor. I know that you deal with these kinds of things in your professional life.
That's
So
right.
when did that come into play? As far as when did you decide to become a
Yeah.
marriage and family therapist, and how did that fit into this part of the story?
Sure. Well, I actually became a marriage and family therapist about 18 years ago.
Okay.
And the reason I became a therapist is because my first husband and I had gone to marriage counseling, and I didn't feel like I was being offered any hope. I felt like what was being put on our marriage was a Band-Aid, and it may have been where I was at that time. I don't wanna necessarily say that the therapist was horrible, but I wasn't getting what I needed. And so that was what actually catapulted me into the idea of someday I'm gonna go back to be a therapist because I want to learn to give hope to others like me who need this hope. And so that's what started my therapy practice. Now, my therapy expertise really helped me in the trauma because, when everything happened, when my ex-husband broke down my bedroom door, one of the very first things I said to myself, well, first I prayed and said, God, keep me alive because my kids are going to need me. I think we're
Mm.
always moms first.
Mhm.
But then I told myself, I said, stay calm and pay attention to his words. Stay one step ahead of what he's thinking. So you need to keep yourself alive. So I think a lot of my therapeutic, I'll say my expertise or my experience really kept me in having a gift of calm as things were unfolding. That doesn't mean I wasn't scared, but it just means I remained calm.
Yeah. So, wow, because and when you were writing, you could tell that the therapy, you could tell, okay, I've been in therapy for a long time, especially the last 10 years, because when my husband had his crash, his mental crash 10 years ago, I too struggled to find a therapist who could help us. In fact,
Yeah.
the very first therapist I went to, it was like the week he had just gotten out of the psychiatric hospital. He'd been there for 7 days. I just picked him up. The next day we were supposed to see her. I was really holding out hope that she was going to help us. And she had told me to order a book. And she just, you know what? She sent me a link. So I just clicked the link, ordered the book. It came to my son's house where we were staying, never even opened the package. So
Yeah.
I didn't even know what book I ordered. I just ordered what she told me to order.
Yeah.
So when we got there and we sat down, we walk in the room and sit down. And the first thing she says is, did you get the book? And I said, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's right here in the envelope. And so I opened up this book and I was so appalled as I pulled it out and realized that it was a book about fixing our marriage.
Yeah.
And she had attributed what was going on to fixing our marriage, even though we had had
Mhm.
a couple of Zoom calls and she knew
Right.
what had gone on. So we never went back to that
Yeah.
counselor. And it began this search for me to find someone who could
Mhm.
help. And it's so, so, so hard. And I think for me, listening to you talk about how your counseling helped you, I think all of the therapy that I had done personally leading up to this actually helped me when I couldn't find a therapist, because there
Yeah.
are some practical things that you can do. So I encourage everyone for therapy, whether your life is perfect or not, because I'm a proponent of the theory that you are either walking into a mess, you're in a mess, or you're coming out of a mess. So, that's just how I feel. And you don't always walk away. I mean, here I am, I'm getting ready to celebrate my 49th wedding anniversary in a few months. So walking away is not always the answer, but that was the answer for
Right.
you. So in
Yeah.
chapter 2 of your book, you write, sometimes we hold on because we've held on for so long that we forget why we're holding on in the first place. And for me, you were describing the end of your marriage. For
Right.
me, what I discovered is I had to come up with a reason to why I would stay. Why
Mhm.
would I stay? Why would I continue in the chaos? And I worked very hard with the therapist I eventually found on creating that reason. And it's
Right.
a reason I have to revisit. And I have it on a
Yeah.
post-it note on my wall, and it's written in my book. It's why
Right.
you do it. So talk to us about this thought of sometimes we hold on because we forget. We hold on for so long because we forget
Sure.
why we're holding on.
Yeah.
And how hard was it for you to let go?
Yeah. I think that I had spent so much time forgiving and forgiving and forgiving and forgiving, but I didn't spend a lot of time setting good boundaries and about health and about protecting myself and so, I was much to blame in my marriage for enabling behavior.
Mhm.
And so I think it just became normal. And, when you make a comment about, the finding a reason to stay, not stay, I love it that you point out we've got two different approaches because we've got two different stories. And
Mhm.
it is so important to find that wise counsel that will hear your story and help you walk through what you need to do, because I needed somebody to talk to me about boundaries and about this isn't okay and that this isn't helping your family. And so I finally, when you ask how hard it was horrible. It was the
Mm.
hardest decision of my life. I cried the day I went and filed. And I had my dad come with me to the lawyer's office, and I remember crying and saying, "Dad, promise me I'm not making a mistake."
Mm,
Because I had made a vow to God, I had made a vow
mm,
to my husband. I took my vows very, very seriously. But I had been watching CNN news at that time, and in my book, I talk about a story about an orca whale that CNN was doing a news story, and it was about a mother whale that had given birth to a calf, which is the baby whale. And the baby whale either didn't live very long or it was deceased at birth, and the mother whale would not let it go. It would swim under that baby calf. Every time it began to slip down and to sink, the mother would swim under and pull it back up. And she carried it, I think it was 1,000 miles, and it was a 17-day, it was a news story for 17 days. And they labeled it an unprecedented tour of grief.
mm.
And when I heard that, I recognized that I had actually been grieving my marriage a very long time. And this is something I actually heard you say on one of your podcasts was you grieve the past, the present, and the future. I
Mhm.
grieved the past of what it had been and what it hadn't been. I grieved the present of what it was and what I wished it would be. And I grieved the future of what I knew it would never be.
Mhm.
And so there was a grieving process, but for me it was okay, this is what I need to do because otherwise I'm going to go under and I'm going to sink too. So
Oh,
it was not an easy decision.
yeah. And I want I'm glad you said that because I think sometimes people look at where you are right now and how it quote turned out
Sure.
and they think, "Oh, you just like I've had people even when I was dealing with my mom in the final stages of her life and we had to make the impossible decision
Mm,
to put my mom on hospice.
mhm.
Because for us, hospice just felt like the final thing. But my
Mhm.
sister and I, who were working on this together, decided it was time. So we did. And I remember a family member confronting me saying, "Well, you're just doing this because you're just done and you don't want to deal with her anymore."
Right.
And and in that moment, it just took my breath away because I think sometimes when people are looking in, they don't see the pressure, the pain, the
Right.
decisions, all of that. And it's hard because none of these decisions, whether
Yeah.
I decide to stay, whether you decide to go, none of it is an easy
Right.
decision. And
Right.
yet both of our decisions were wrapped around the idea of our kids,
Mhm.
and how is this going to affect our children?
Mhm.
And it's just an interesting journey. So one of the other things I loved about your book was that you close every chapter with this pause and reflect moment. And because your story is so dramatic and we get so pulled into your story, you challenge the reader at the end of each chapter to stop and kind of personalize it and pull their story into it.
Right.
And I love that because you have so many incredible nuggets of wisdom and encouragement that I think we would miss if we didn't take that moment to just even take a breath from the story that you're telling.
Mhm.
And then you share a prayer, which I love because it reminds us to go back to that
Right.
spiritual foundation, which both you and I agree is is the only way we survive the chaos and the trauma. So at the end of chapter 3, which is called A Time to Laugh, and I love that. You challenge us to put on a worship song and dance, and that is one of my mini vacation ideas that I share with my caregivers. It's very easy to take a mini vacation, go in a room, close the door, turn the music up really loud, put on, one of the most uplifting Christian worship songs you can find and just dance. I say that all the time. And I discovered in your book that laughter and joy is so important for our challenging
Mhm.
journeys, but share with us why, for you, laughter and joy
Sure.
is so important.
Well, and let me preface in that I really don't dance. I am a
Me neither.
horrible dancer.
Me
And
too.
so when I dance, I'm like doing the swim or I'm holding my nose or I'm making a fool of myself and I make myself, but it actually makes me laugh. In
Yeah.
fact, just last night, my husband and I were watching an award show on television, a music awards, and it was funny because I started to dance, and I told him, I said, I don't know why they don't ask me to be the backup. It was but joy when we go through hard things, and I use the word trauma, but trauma doesn't have to be something dramatic. It doesn't have to be your husband has a mental breakdown or you're kidnapped and assaulted. Trauma is anything that leaves a lasting impact on you,
Mhm.
and it can affect the way you view yourself, God, and others. It is something that is so impactful. So, because sometimes people will say, well, what I went through isn't as bad as what you went through. And I like to say, pain is pain is pain. There is no pain Olympics. I have felt grief and loss. You have felt grief and loss. And there is no measure of whose is deeper. And so when we go through anything hard, our joy and our laughter can be the very first things that go. And I think that that's exactly what the enemy wants. He wants us to lose our joy and our laughter. And it doesn't mean that on day one, I was laughing and thinking, oh, I'm going to find some joy and laughter, because there's a time and there is a season for it. We just don't want to lose it indefinitely. And so, several things is joy and laughter. It reconnects us. It reconnects us to where we are. Praise breaks the chains of the enemy. And, when I, as a therapist, especially when I'm with my young teenage clients, I will tell them at the end of our session, it's like, okay, at the last 30 seconds, you can play anything off your song list, and we're just going to shake off the heaviness, because our body holds emotions,
Mhm.
and emotions get trapped in our bodies. And so we don't even realize how tense our bodies are and how much we're being affected. And so we will just shake it off. And I kind of laugh because I've danced to more songs I would never listen to in my life. But that's usually their favorite part of the session, is they know we're going to shake this off because we container it. And it doesn't mean we have to wait for the hard to be over for us to find the laughter or the joy. It's we can container it and say, you know what, I have felt this hard and I felt this grief, and I'm just going to container it for a little bit and give myself just a breather of where I'm going to allow some of this to come back in.
Yeah. And laughter also changes our genetics. I mean, or,
It does.
it changes us physically because it lets those endorphins go. We start to feel better. And yeah, so yeah, I did an interview very early on in the series of the podcast with my 9-year-old grandson. And he wanted so desperately to be on my podcast. And so I said, well, we have to find a topic. And came to me one day and he's like, laughter. Let's talk about
Yes.
laughter. And even to this day, he will remind me about that podcast and how important
Mhm.
laughter is. But it is so true. The other thing that I pulled from your book is that I often talk to my listeners about asking the wrong question. And I have a whole chapter in my book about that.
Sure.
Because when the whole thing started with my husband, I was asking the wrong question. And then you have to change to the right question. So for me, I was asking, why is this happening to me? Why is
Right.
this happening to me? And God finally told me, no, you're supposed to say, okay, this is happening. Now what? And in chapter 6, you actually talk in that chapter, which is called A Time to Heal, about moving from why me to what now, which is very similar to what
Right.
I had done. So break down your thoughts for us on that statement.
Yeah. I think that I like to say God welcomes our questions. He welcomes our doubts. He welcomes our all of our emotions because he gave them to us. But in the initial stages, it's normal to say, but why? It's kind of like when our kids are little and we give them an answer and they say, but why? And we give them another answer and they say, but why? And we're not going to understand it. We don't see the whole picture. And so when I write that my book is not about a villain and a victim, is we have choices that we get to make. I can sit in the but why? It's not fair. Why didn't it happen to them? Why this, why that? But it's not going to change anything, except it may change my countenance and my mood and my mental health. And so there's a moving to, okay, this has happened. So what am I going to do? And that's a part of really making a choice when hard things happen. We're going to heal.
Mhm.
And when I was sitting in the emergency room that day, My oldest daughter asked me, she said, "Mom, do you remember what you said to me on that day in the emergency room?" And I said, "No, I don't remember." And she goes, "Mom, you looked at me and you said, 'Promise me you will not let this make you bitter.'"
Mm,
And then the detective that was assigned to my case, she was training another detective, and I saw her a year later, year and a half later, and she said, "Kim, do you remember what you said to me that day?" And I said, "No, I don't." And she said, "You looked at me and you said, 'I will not let this experience go to waste. I will be a better therapist because of it.'"
mm,
Now, it didn't mean I wasn't hurting, I wasn't angry, I wasn't fearful and scared. It didn't doesn't mean I felt wonderful, but I knew I was making a choice that day that no matter what it took, I was going to heal.
mm,
And there's a story in the Bible about a woman named Naomi. And she and her husband have two sons, and they leave their homeland of Bethlehem for a foreign land. And they raise their two sons, who later grow up and get married. But through the years, Naomi's husband and both her sons die. And she takes one of her daughter in laws back with her to Bethlehem. And when the women see Naomi, they greet her and they
mhm,
say, "Naomi." And Naomi's response is, "Do not call me Naomi anymore. God took me out full, but he's bringing me back empty and bitter. He's bringing me back. God caused this." And she made a declaration. She said, "From now on, call me Mara," which means bitter.
mm,
So Naomi changed her own name, and she changed it to her circumstances, and she
mhm,
changed it to the past. When God changes our name, he changes it to the future and our promise and our potential. And so there was a point I knew I could call myself angry, bitter, unforgiving, resentful, stuck. Life is hopeless. This is as good as it gets. But that wasn't who I wanted to be. And so I made the choice. It's like whatever work it's going to take, I will be happy and joyful and forgiving and prosperous, and I will move forward, and there will be life again. I will laugh again.
I I love that. That's so beautiful because it's true. And you actually write this in your book as well, that trusting God's leadership also means trusting his plan. And that's one of the things that I have always just really clung to from the day I left my husband in the psychiatric hospital was, okay, God, you have a plan. Now, 10 years ago, I had no
Mhm.
idea that he would open up the door for me to have an incredible ministry for caregivers.
Sure.
But that God knew that all along. He knew that. And when we look back at the fingerprints and how he uses those
Mhm.
circumstances, and I love that your book is going to touch so many lives
Mhm.
because you're being authentic and transparent with your story, and you don't go into a lot of the details. So don't read this book because you want details. It's You're not going to get a lot of the details
Right,
because
right,
the details aren't important. What's
right.
important is that God is using your story and the plan was in your story. So, how can you trust God in trauma? And how did you see this, or how are you seeing this as a plan that He had all along?
Sure. God does not cause our trauma, but he's not surprised that it came either, because
Mhm.
God knows the beginning from the ending, and he already had a provision to walk us through. And we can say God is good even when circumstances aren't. And so when we trust God's plan, it doesn't mean I understand God's plan. It just says, "God, I'm going to trust that you know something I don't."
Yeah.
And it is definitely a choice. Trusting is a choice. And some of that comes with surrender, the choice to surrender. Because when something hard happens, we want to control. It's normal reaction. We want to control. When everything happened for me, I told God what he should do, when he should do it, how he should do it, and it would make a great testimony.
Yeah.
And instead, it was like, "No, no, 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 no. I'm going to do what I need to do in the right timing. And in that trusting, you're going to watch and see." But releasing that control, I never felt like releasing control. I never felt
Mhm.
like trusting. In fact, I prayed and I told the Lord, I said, "Lord, I'm scared to trust you, because what if what you want isn't what I want? And what if I
Mhm.
don't get what I want? I even told the Lord, if Andrew is not your best for me, then it's okay. I'll settle for second best. I mean, I was like bargaining with the Lord. And I finally got to the point where I told the Lord, it was like, Lord, I am going to choose to trust you even in my fear. I'm going to offer a sacrifice of praise and I'm going to lift my hands when my heart is heavy. I'm going to
Mm,
say you're worthy when my world is falling apart because, you know, my faith became my anchor. I didn't
mm,
understand it, but I just knew that in the beginning I felt very abandoned by God, but and then I was like, no, but I see you were there, but I still feel abandoned. And it was this, you know, tug of war a little bit. And I'd say I trust you, and then oop, but then I tried to take it back into my own hands. And
mm,
so really the trusting was a choice that said, I don't feel like it. It's not my feelings.
mm.
I'm making a choice. I will trust you. I will surrender this to you. And I had to do that time and time and time and time again.
And I love that at the end of your book, in the epilogue, you talk about the 5 key lessons that you learned when going through adversity. And I'm not gonna tell the listeners what the 5 are, but they're amazing. You have to buy the book. There'll be a link in the show notes. Click the link and get the book. But number 3, and you just kinda talked about it a little
Mhm.
bit. Number 3 was healing is a daily choice. And what
Mhm.
you just talked about, and what we've kind of been talking about this whole time, is that we can learn these lessons, but you don't just learn them and walk away. You don't let's learn
Right.
them and know them. It's a daily choice. And joy is a daily choice. And healing is a daily choice. And forgiveness is a daily choice. And just continuing to trust is a daily choice. So as we close out our time together, I think you and I could sit here and talk forever. But as we close out today, is there one last thought that you would like to leave us with?
Yes. And let me first of all say to the listeners who will be wondering, Andrew did survive. And let me just jump just for a second and tell a little bit of the end of the story. In
Yes.
that it was probably almost 6 weeks later, and I got a Facebook Messenger message from Andrew, and he said, "Hey, I'm alive." And I went up to see him in the hospital. And when I went up to see him in the hospital, I said, "Where does this leave us?" And he said, "I don't know." He goes, "I've seen all the felony counts. I know you're going to be messed up." He goes, "I know what happened to me and I'm going to be messed up." And I shook my finger in his face and I said, "Andrew Hart, you will never meet another woman like me." And 4 weeks later, we were married. We were engaged. And then 4 months later, we were married. And that has been 8 years ago. So it has been a wonderful 8 years, but it was a summer and longer. You know, I think my final thoughts are really that healing, there's no expiration date on
Mm,
it. It's not that we arrive and say, "Okay, I'm all healed." Because you know what? Even now, 8 years later, I can have a memory come up and I may have a feeling of frustration or I may have a feeling of anger that comes up. And I get to remind myself, you know what? I made a choice to forgive. That's
mm,
under the blood of Jesus. And today I'm going to forgive again. Or today I'm going to be joyful again. Or today I may let myself feel the sad.
mhm,
I may let myself, you know, there is nothing linear in healing. It sometimes it was 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, but it didn't mean I wasn't healing. And so I think to the listeners, I would just say as long as you are making a small step, heal at your pace. Don't let anybody rush you, don't let anybody cookie cutter it or tell you
mm,
what you should or shouldn't do. It's just so important that we one make a choice that we want to heal. We make a choice that even though we don't feel like it, we're willing to surrender and let go
mm,
of that control and say, "God, I don't understand your plan, but I'm going to choose to trust you."
mm.
And when we do that, little by little, our healing begins to come.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. So, how can the listeners connect with you if they want to?
Yes. Well, they can go to my website, kimberlyhar.com, and that's Kimberly. And then my last name is Haar. kimberlyhaar.com. I'm also on all the socials. I'm on Instagram at kimberly.haar. On Facebook, it's Kimberly J. Haar. So go to your bookstores. You can look hard and you'll find me.
And make it very easy for you to find her, listeners, because I'm going to put all of that in the show notes. So all you'll have to do is click and boom, you will be there. And I am going to put a link again. I'm going to put a link for her book, incredible book, in the show notes. Just click the link, buy the book, and read the story. I promise you, it is full of just encouragement and inspiration. So, listeners, I am so thankful for all of you who joined us and listened in on our conversation today. And if you know a caretaker, will you share this show with them? Also, if you would follow or subscribe to the podcast, that is so important because that is how other caretakers can find us. And then make sure you go to the website, the caretakersjourney.com, and join the mailing list because a new weekly newsletter is going to be launching in June. And that newsletter is going to be full of inspiration and tips and giveaways and just information about some fun events that are going to be coming up in 2025 and 2026. And the email community will always hear that information first. And I hope that you will join me again next week for another meaningful conversation about what it looks like to be on the caretaker's journey. And until then, it's all about him.